The hammer fell silent against cold iron. Walter's weathered hands trembled as he stared at the three small figures standing in his doorway, snow melting from their ragged coats onto the wooden floor of his forge. For 23 winters he had lit this fire alone, speaking his son's name to the flames like a prayer to deaf heavens. But tonight, these orphaned children carried something impossible in their frozen fingers, a letter bearing the name he thought the earth had swallowed forever. The youngest child stepped forward, her voice cutting through his disbelief like a blade through his chest. The December wind howled across the Missouri plains like a wounded animal, carrying with it the scent of snow and the promise of another bitter winter. Walter McKinnon stood before his forge, the same forge where his father had taught him to bend iron to his will, where his own son had once watched with wide eyes as sparks danced in the darkness. The old blacksmith's hands, scarred by decades of fire and metal, reached for the bellows with the reverence of a priest approaching an altar. This was his ritual, his sacred duty to memory. 23 years had passed since the fever took young Thomas. 23 winters of lighting this fire, not for the work of his hands, but for the work of his heart. Each flame that leaped from the coal was a word he had never spoken, each spark a tear he had refused to shed. The townspeople of Cedar Ridge had long since stopped questioning why the old blacksmith worked through the coldest nights of winter, hammering nothing but air and sorrow. They understood that some men forge their grief into something harder than steel, something that can bear the weight of endless winters. The forge roared to life under Walter's careful tending, casting dancing shadows across the walls, lined with tools that had grown cold from disuse. His business had dwindled to almost nothing. The railroad had brought machine-made goods that could be purchased for less than the cost of his craftsmanship. But Walter cared little for profit now. His true work began when the sun disappeared behind the western hills, when the world grew quiet enough to hear the whispers of the dead. He would speak Thomas's name to the flames, tell him about the changing seasons, about the new families that had moved to town, about the loneliness that had become his only faithful companion. Tonight felt different, though Walter could not say why. The wind carried an unusual restlessness, and the fire seemed to burn with an intensity that made him step back from its heat. He had learned to read the language of flame and ember, and tonight they spoke of change, of something approaching from the darkness beyond his door. The old man shook his head, dismissing such fanciful thoughts as the product of too many solitary winters. Yet his eyes kept drifting toward the window, where snow had begun to fall in thick, silent curtains. The letter lay on his workbench, unopened and gathering dust. A correspondence from his sister in Kansas City that had arrived 3 days ago. Walter had no stomach for news from the outside world, no desire to hear about lives that continued to unfold while his own had stopped the day they lowered Thomas into the frozen ground. He preferred the company of his memories, the familiar ache that had become as much a part of him as his own heartbeat. The fire crackled and hissed, and Walter closed his eyes, letting the heat wash over his face like a benediction. But as the wind grew stronger and the snow fell harder, Walter found himself thinking of other winters, other storms, and the way Thomas used to press his small face against the window, watching for travelers who might need shelter from the cold. The boy had possessed a kindness that seemed to glow from within, a light that had made even the darkest winter nights feel warm. Now, as Walter stood alone in his forge, he wondered if that light had truly died with his son, or if it lived on somewhere in the world, waiting to find its way home through the storm. The knock came soft and hesitant, barely audible above the storm's fury, yet it struck Walter's heart with the force of a sledgehammer against an anvil. He had not heard that sound, the tentative rap of small knuckles against weathered wood, in more years than he cared to count. For a moment he stood frozen, wondering if the wind and his own desperate longing had conspired to create phantom visitors. But the knock came again, more urgent now, accompanied by the muffled voices of children calling through the storm. Walter's legs felt heavy as lead as he crossed the forge, each step echoing in the sudden silence that had fallen over his sanctuary. His hand trembled as it reached for the door handle, and he paused, afraid of what he might find on the other side. In his dreams, Thomas sometimes came to him as he had been, 7 years old, bright-eyed, full of questions about the world and its mysteries. But Walter had learned long ago that dreams were cruel companions, offering hope only to snatch it away with the coming of dawn. The door swung open to reveal 3 small figures huddled together against the cold, their faces red with wind and exhaustion, their clothes thin and inadequate against the winter's bite. The oldest, a boy of perhaps 11, held the hands of 2 younger children, a girl of 9 and another girl who could not have been more than 7. They looked up at Walter with eyes that held too much knowledge of hardship, too much understanding of what it meant to be alone in an unforgiving world. Yet beneath their weariness, he saw something else, a flicker of hope that reminded him painfully of his son. "Please, mister," the oldest boy said, his voice barely above a whisper, "we've been walking for days. We heard there was a blacksmith in Cedar Ridge who might have work, might have a warm place to sleep." The words tumbled from his lips like water from a broken dam, and Walter could see the desperation behind his careful politeness. These were children who had learned to beg without begging, to ask for help while maintaining their dignity. They were orphans, he realized, cast adrift in a world that had little patience for the unwanted and unloved. Walter's throat constricted as he looked down at them, seeing in their faces the echo of every child who had ever needed shelter, every small soul who had ever stood at his door seeking warmth. But it was the youngest girl who undid him completely. She clutched a folded piece of paper in her small fist, and when she looked up at him, her eyes held the same earnest intensity that Thomas had possessed. "We have something for you," she said, her voice clear despite the chattering of her teeth. "A man in the last town said we should bring it to Walter McKinnon, the blacksmith who lights fires for his boy. To discern." The words hit Walter like a physical blow, driving the breath from his lungs and sending his heart racing with a mixture of fear and impossible hope. How could these children know about his ritual, about the fires he lit in Thomas's memory? Who had sent them to his door with knowledge that he had shared with no living soul? His hands shook as he stepped aside, gesturing for them to enter his forge, his mind reeling with questions that had no rational answers. The storm howled behind them as they crossed his threshold, and Walter felt as though he stood at the edge of a precipice, about to leap into an abyss from which there might be no return. The letter trembled in Walter's weathered hands like a living thing desperate to escape. The parchment was yellowed at the edges, worn smooth by countless fingers, and bore the unmistakable scent of distant places, sagebrush, leather, and something else he couldn't name. The children sat in a perfect semicircle around the forge, their eyes reflecting the dancing flames as they watched him with the patience of those who had learned to wait for miracles. Outside, the wind had died to a whisper, as if the entire world held its breath for what was about to unfold. Walter's fingers traced the familiar handwriting on the envelope, and his heart hammered against his ribs like a caged bird fighting for freedom. The oldest boy, Thomas, spoke first, his voice carrying the weight of secrets too heavy for his young shoulders. "He told us to find the blacksmith who lit fires in winter," he said, his words falling into the silence like stones into still water. "Said you'd know what the letter meant, even if we didn't." Walter's hands shook as he turned the envelope over, seeing his own name written in a script he had mourned for 3 long years. The middle child, a girl with eyes like autumn leaves, reached into her tattered coat and pulled out a small metal object that caught the firelight. It was a horseshoe nail, bent into the shape of a cross, blackened by forge fire and polished smooth by worried fingers. Walter's breath caught in his throat as he recognized his own handiwork, a piece he had made for his son's first communion 15 years ago. The youngest boy, barely more than a whisper of humanity wrapped in oversized clothes, crawled closer to Walter's boots and looked up with eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of ages. "Mister, he said you taught him that fire don't just make things, it changes them," the child said, his small hand reaching out to touch the leather apron that hung from Walter's waist. "Said sometimes a man has to burn away what he was to become, what he's meant to be." The words hit Walter like physical blows, each syllable a memory of conversations held over glowing coals, of lessons passed from father to son in the sacred space between hammer and anvil. He remembered teaching those very words to a boy who had stood no taller than these children, whose eager hands had learned to shape metal and dreams with equal skill. Walter's fingers found the seal of the letter, and he hesitated, knowing that once broken, there would be no returning to the comfortable certainty of his grief. The girl with autumn eyes stood and moved to his side, her small hand covering his gnarled knuckles with surprising warmth. "He said you might be scared," she whispered, her voice carrying the gentle authority of someone who had comforted others through their darkest hours. "Said fear was just love with nowhere to go, and that you'd taught him that too." The forge fire crackled and sparked, sending shadows dancing across the walls like ghosts of all the conversations that had taken place in this sacred space. Walter closed his eyes and felt the weight of 3 years of unanswered prayers, of nights spent talking to empty air, of a love that had nowhere to land. The letter opened with a sound like a sigh, and Walter's eyes fell upon words that seemed to glow in the firelight. "Pa," it began, and the simple word nearly brought him to his knees. "If you're reading this, then the children found you, and the fire is burning again." His son's voice seemed to speak from the page, carrying with it the cadence of a man who had learned hard truths in distant places. The letter spoke of a life lived in shadows, of choices made in desperation, of a young man who had faked his own death to escape debts that would have destroyed his father's reputation. It told of years spent working in silver mines in Colorado, of money saved and sent anonymously to pay off the family's creditors, of a love that had never dimmed despite the necessary deception. As Walter read the final lines, his vision blurred with tears that had been 3 years in the making. "I'm coming home for Christmas, Pa. The children will show you where to find me. Light the fire one more time, not for the dead, but for the living." The letter fell from his trembling hands as the 3 orphans moved closer, their small bodies forming a circle of warmth around his chair. Outside, the first snow of winter began to fall, each flake catching the light from the forge like tiny stars descending from heaven to bless this moment of impossible resurrection. The youngest boy climbed onto Walter's lap with the fearless trust of a child who had learned to recognize safe harbors in the storm of an uncertain world. His small fingers traced the lines of grief that had carved themselves deep into the blacksmith's weathered face, and Walter felt something inside his chest crack open, like ice breaking on a spring river. "He's been taking care of us," the child whispered, his breath warm against Walter's ear. "In the mine town, when nobody else would." The girl with autumn eyes nodded solemnly, her hands folded in her lap like a small prayer. "He told us stories about you every night," she said, her voice carrying the weight of shared secrets, "about the things you made together, about the way you could read the fire like other people read books." Thomas, the oldest, stood and walked to the forge, his young face serious beyond his years as he stared into the dancing flames. "He's been sending money," he said quietly, his words falling into the silence like confessions whispered in a church. "Every month for 2 years, to the bank in town. Said it was to pay back what was owed, to make things right." Walter's heart lurched as pieces of a puzzle he hadn't known existed began to fall into place. The mysterious payments that had saved his shop, the anonymous donations that had kept him from losing everything, they hadn't been miracles after all, but the sacrificial love of a son who had chosen exile over his father's ruin. The children had carried this burden of knowledge across hundreds of miles, their small shoulders bearing the weight of a secret that could resurrect the dead. The girl moved to a corner of the shop where Walter kept his finished work, her fingers trailing over horseshoes and nails with the reverence of someone touching holy relics. "He made us promise," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Made us swear on our parents' graves that we'd find you before Christmas, that we'd bring the letter and the proof." She pulled from her coat a small leather pouch that clinked softly with the sound of coins, and Walter's breath caught as he recognized the craftsmanship. It was his own work, a money pouch he had made for his son's 16th birthday, tooled with intricate patterns that told the story of their family's history. Inside, he knew, would be enough money to keep the forge burning for another year, another gift from a ghost who had learned to love from the shadows. The youngest boy's head grew heavy against Walter's shoulder, and the old blacksmith found himself stroking the child's hair with hands that had forgotten how to offer comfort. "Are you really his papa?" the boy asked, his voice thick with approaching sleep. "He talks about you like you hung the moon and stars." Walter's throat tightened as he looked down at this small creature who had traveled so far to deliver a miracle. These children had become the bridge between his grief and his hope, their innocent faith carrying a love that had seemed lost forever. They had walked through winter storms and slept under hostile stars, driven by a promise made to a man who had taught them that some bonds could never be broken, not even by death itself. Thomas returned from the forge, his young face illuminated by the dancing light, and Walter saw in his expression the same determination that had once burned in his son's eyes. "He's waiting in the old cabin by Miller's Creek," the boy said, his words careful and measured. "Said he couldn't come here until he knew you'd forgive him, until he knew the shame wouldn't kill you both." The cabin, Walter remembered it well. A place where he and his son had gone fishing every summer, where they had shared dreams and fears under star-filled skies. It seemed fitting that redemption would wait in a place where love had been born and nurtured, where a father had taught his son to cast lines into moving water and trust that something good would bite. The fire in the forge began to die down, its flames settling into glowing coals that pulsed like a sleeping heart. Walter looked at the three children who had become his unlikely angels, their faces peaceful in the warm light, and felt the first stirrings of something he had thought dead forever. Hope, fragile as a newborn colt, began to take its first tentative steps in the wasteland of his heart. Tomorrow, he would bank the fire and walk to Miller's Creek, carrying with him the love that had never died and the forgiveness that had been waiting 3 long years to be born. Dawn broke over the Missouri landscape like a promise whispered in the dark, painting the snow-covered ground in shades of rose and gold that seemed to herald the birth of something sacred. Walter stood at his forge for the last time as a man who believed his son was dead, his hands moving through the familiar ritual of banking the fire with the reverence of a priest preparing for communion. The 3 children slept in the corner, wrapped in horse blankets and dreams, their small bodies curled together like puppies seeking warmth. He had fed them biscuits and honey before they slept, watching their faces transform with the simple joy of full bellies and safe shelter. Now, as morning light streamed through the windows of his shop, Walter felt the weight of 3 years lifting from his shoulders like chains falling away. The walk to Miller's Creek stretched before him like a pilgrimage through his own resurrection, each step carrying him further from the man he had been and closer to the father he was meant to become again. The snow crunched beneath his boots with the sound of breaking glass, and his breath formed clouds in the crisp air that seemed to carry his prayers upward to a sky that had finally remembered how to listen. Behind him, the children followed at a distance, their presence a comfort and a witness to this moment of impossible grace. They had insisted on coming, these small guardians of miracles, their faith stronger than his fear and their love deeper than his doubt. The creek ran dark and swift beneath a thin skin of ice, its waters singing the same song they had sung when he and his son had cast their lines into its depths years ago. The cabin sat on the far bank like a memory made solid, smoke rising from its chimney in a thin grey line that spoke of warmth and waiting. Walter's heart hammered against his ribs as he approached the door, his hand trembling as he reached for the latch. Inside, he could hear movement, the soft sound of someone pacing, and he knew that on the other side of this threshold waited either the greatest joy or the cruelest deception of his life. The children gathered behind him, their small hands reaching out to touch his coat, their presence a reminder that some miracles required witnesses to make them real. The door opened before he could knock, and Walter found himself face to face with a man who wore his son's eyes in a face carved lean by hard work and harder choices. 3 years had changed the boy into something stronger and more weathered, but the smile that spread across his features was the same one that had lit up Walter's world for 23 years. "Hello, Pa," his son said, his voice breaking on the simple words like a dam giving way to floodwaters. Walter's knees nearly buckled as he reached out with shaking hands to touch the face he had mourned, to feel the solid warmth of flesh that proved this was no dream or fever vision. The children pressed closer, their small bodies forming a circle of witness around this moment of resurrection, their eyes bright with tears they were too young to understand. Father and son fell into each other's arms with the desperate hunger of men who had been drowning and suddenly found air to breathe. Walter felt his son's heartbeat against his chest, strong and steady and real, and the last of his doubt crumbled like walls built on sand. "I'm sorry," his son whispered against his shoulder, the words muffled by tears and time and the weight of choices that had seemed necessary in the darkness. "I'm so sorry, Pa. I thought it was the only way to save you, to save everything we'd built." Walter held him tighter, his own tears falling like rain on parched earth, and felt the pieces of his broken world beginning to reassemble themselves into something new and beautiful and whole. The youngest child tugged at Walter's coat, his small face serious as he looked up at the reunited father and son. "Mister," he said, his voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had learned that love could survive anything, even death itself. "Does this mean we can all go home now?" Walter looked down at this small angel who had carried a miracle across winter storms and hostile miles, then at his son whose eyes held the same question. Home. The word had new meaning now, expanded to include not just the forge and the familiar rhythms of his old life, but these 3 children who had become the instruments of grace, the small hands that had reached into the darkness and pulled his son back into the light. The fire would burn again, not just in memory of the dead, but in celebration of the living, and the sound of children's laughter would once again echo through the sacred space where metal was shaped and dreams were forged into reality.